You ever just use a term a lot to describe things, and it's not that you don't know what that term means, but more so you don't really know how to explain it if someone ever decided to ask you to do that. That term for me is atmosphere. I use it a lot.
Created an iconic mood and atmosphere,
All with their own tones, atmosphere. The atmosphere just draws you right back into this game.
This aids in the atmosphere of the game.
The two I agree with are the ones with changes to the atmosphere of the game. That perfecting the tense and chilling atmosphere on the Ishimura, I was enthralled by the dark and gritty atmosphere that it had.
It offers a surprising atmosphere, most notably the atmosphere of Stalker.
Atmosphere.
And the atmosphere they provide alone makes Majora's Mask
Really nails the atmosphere.
About that were created by this otherworldly atmosphere lends to the atmosphere as well. The awesome atmosphere and two things I value most in gaming: atmosphere and immersion. Other than the story, the game really nails the atmosphere. If you love the atmosphere and immersion of the Metro series, capturing the feel and the atmosphere of the movie, it sort of feeds from the atmosphere of the game: vodka and sausage. The atmosphere. But for me, this game is about the atmosphere. Focusing on atmosphere more than visceral in-your-face horror. Each and every area is just crammed with atmosphere. If you follow my channel for any amount of time, you know that I like me some atmosphere. Takes from the creepy atmospheric Von Braun, flooding your lungs with atmosphere. You might as well call me an astronaut because you know I love atmosphere.
But I use the word atmosphere in good faith. It isn't filler or a buzzword, it's genuinely something that I use not only to make videos, but I use in my own feelings towards a game as well. Atmosphere is the #1 thing that I strive for and appreciate in a video game. So let's take a dive into the word and get a definition on what exactly atmosphere is when it comes to video games.
Jump on a train to Saint Denis, jump on a boat, or avoid Guam.
Where?
Forget about it.
Atmosphere is tricky to define because it's such a vague term, but it's something that everyone can understand. It's intuitive. If you've played an atmospheric video game, then you know it when you play it, and you certainly remember that feeling when you think back on it. Atmosphere is one of the biggest factors when it comes to creating immersion, another term that's difficult to define, but again, intuitive, and if you've played video games, then you know what it is and you understand it. Simply put, it's becoming, well, immersed in the game. You lose track of time and space around you and get sucked into the game. It can happen with games, movies, books, music, paintings, anything really. Something that's able to suck you into itself and have you lost within the world that it builds. The story that it tells, the environment, the lore, and everything that there is to offer. Supergiant Games writer and designer Greg Kasavin, one of the lead creators on Bastion, had an insightful talk about atmosphere in video games several years ago. He uses the game Bastion as an example towards atmosphere and how to define it. He comes up with 2 definitions. The first being, atmosphere is a mixture of elements that help sustain immersion within the game world. Again, immersion is the aspect of getting lost inside of a world, and atmosphere is what helps us bind into it. And the second definition being, atmosphere is the combination of a game's theme, or a central idea behind the game, and the game's tone, or the author's attitude towards the game. The theme brings a categorical idea of the game to the audience, and the tone helps differentiate that game within that category. For example, take Ratchet and Clank and Metroid. Both science fiction games involving hopping across planets and destroying enemies, but because of the tonal differences, Metroid being dark and edgy and Ratchet and Clank being cartoony and comical, these games are entirely different in our minds with absolute opposite atmospheres. Other examples could be made of Frostpunk and City Skylines, both city building and resource management games, but Frostpunk is set in a frozen tundra apocalypse and lives are constantly at risk due to your decisions. And City Skylines is a lot more lighthearted, to say the least. Same could be said with other games like Don't Starve and The Long Dark or Metro Exodus and Rage 2, all games similar to each other thematically, but the tone separates them immensely. These are 2 great definitions, and if you needed to just define the term in simple words, then this is adequate. But to me, it doesn't help describe what I'm feeling when I say Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl is dripping in atmosphere, or how The Warriors atmosphere makes you take a step back from the awesome gameplay. To me, atmosphere is the feeling that remains after the rest of the game shuts down. Take Dead Space for example. Take away the awesome visuals and the dynamic lighting, take away the strategic dismemberment of the combat, the terrifying sound design, the story not only from the narrative but discovered audio logs and text logs, take it all away and there's still something left, something that sticks with you. That's the atmosphere. It's a byproduct of the reaction of combining all the elements inside a game. And the more cohesive that all these elements are, then the more reactive the byproduct is, or the more present the atmosphere is. Take cellular respiration. During the process of glycolysis, where glucose is oxidized and results in carbon dioxide and water. But also, boom, ATP, motherfucking energy is released. That's the atmosphere. So, as we've reached this understanding of atmosphere, how is it applied into video games, and why are some games considered more atmospheric than others? Why are games like Dead Space and Fallout often praised for atmosphere, when many other games aren't described at all using atmosphere to its benefit? Moving on, I'm going to use Bastion as a consistent reference for points because Greg Casavin's talk was so informative and laid out such concise examples of how Supergiant intended to inject atmosphere into the game. It's just too valuable not to mention it. But I'll also use examples of other games as well to further explain the concepts. And if you don't know what Bastion is, it's an action-adventure game where you play as the Kid. The Kid's world is flipped-turned upside down, and he has to navigate floaty fantasy world environments, fighting various enemies, and gathering crystals to recreate the Bastion, an ancient sanctuary that can help set the world right again. To get a sense of the atmosphere, Bastion's theme is post-apocalypse fantasy with a tone that is dreamlike and melancholic, but also harsh and gritty. Visuals and overall aesthetic is absolutely necessary to represent the game's tone. They don't need to be realistic by any means. In fact, a lot of times when developers go for hyper-realistic graphics, the game suffers atmospherically. Compare Borderlands and Bulletstorm. Both are comical post-apocalypse shooters that happen to start with the letter B. But where one goes for photorealism, well, for the time, the other invents its own cartoonish style, which suits the overall feeling of the game much more appropriately, and in turn creates a more cohesive experience. Also, games like Journey or Abzu have a very specific art direction and tone cohesion with the visuals that the atmosphere ends up benefiting tremendously, even though the graphics aren't incredibly flashy. Now, in Bastion, the world reflects the fantasy aesthetic. The levels are hand-painted, colorful, and vibrant that literally unfold before your eyes as you're experiencing it firsthand as the story's told. The world forms beneath your feet, solidifying the dreamlike experience. On the other hand though, even though having hyper-realistic graphics is usually a deterrent to tonal cohesion, it is sometimes done extremely well. Games like The Last of Us 2 or Resident Evil 7, both with extremely realistic visuals, but they are visuals that still lend to the overall aesthetic of the product and in the end contribute to the atmosphere. Going along with the actual graphics of the game, the UI also needs to be incorporated into the tone. And sometimes, even in the most immersive game, the loading screens and the UI is often a low point that can break cohesion. Dead Space, of course, is one of the best examples of incorporating menus, character interactions, and HUD elements all into the game seamlessly. Isaac's suit has a health meter and a stasis meter built into it, and each gun has ammunition counters on them that you can easily see in the third-person perspective. Whenever a character wants to reach you, they pop up as a projection in front of Isaac that you can see and work around so you can continue to explore. Dead Space rarely has you taken out of the gameplay to view a menu or interact with anything, and most loading is done within the level design, like when you're in an elevator. Dead Space is obviously one of the best at atmosphere, as it always comes up in these conversations. Gameplay is a tricky factor when it comes to being cohesive within a set tone and world. There's a multitude of different genres of games that employ different gameplays. There are shooters, RPGs, city builders, survival games, and so on. No one type of gameplay lends itself to being more atmospheric than the other. It all leads back to cohesiveness between all the moving parts of the game. Regardless of the type of gameplay, pacing is one of the more important aspects of gameplay. Pacing is usually attributed to tension within a game. Fast-paced gameplay like that in Doom Eternal is important in portraying the intense action and providing tension in the form of non-stop demon slaying. However, tension can be built in slower-paced games as well. Games like Amnesia, where tension is still high because of the threat present in combination with what little the player has available to them to react to said threat. Slow pacing, of course, also lends itself to lowering tension in games like Stardew Valley, where they don't have inherent tension building at all times, but it's also meant to be a relaxing game. You might be racing against the hours you have left in the day sometimes if you have a lot you want to get done, but it's an easy game to play casually and you take your time to do whatever you want to do. Pacing lends a massive hand towards the level of tension, which is a great aspect developers use when determining the type of atmosphere that they will be striving for. Interaction within the world is another way that it's important to stay consistent. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 takes care to keep immersion on par with its hyper-realistic graphics. Looting a corpse doesn't involve opening a menu to search their belongings, but instead, Arthur will turn over the body, rummaging through his pockets, and the items he snatches are shown briefly on screen before belonging to you in your inventory. Buying a gun involves entering a shop that sells firearms and browsing a catalog that's on the counter, reading over the specs and summaries of each firearm, all consistent within the world of the game, and once selecting the firearm, the dealer grabs it for you and it's yours. And speaking of firearms, the way that Arthur carries and treats his firearms is realistic as well. You don't have unlimited inventory, you simply have weapons that you can carry on you. Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of those games that went all out with the photorealism and had to stay on par with other elements in order to stay consistent, and is one of those games that has excelled at it and in turn creates a very atmospheric product. In Dead Space, the mechanic of strategic dismemberment when dispatching the necromorphs is a unique aspect of gameplay done well to incorporate itself into the game world. The agile and aggressive necromorphs are best handled by severing limbs rather than just loading them up with plasma rounds. And the design of the weapons, primarily the plasma cutter shooting in a line, is the perfect combination of slicing off an arm or a leg of the monsters after your face. In contrast, something the Resident Evil franchise does not so well in terms of gameplay, especially in the newer and more realistic depiction of the games like the RE2 and 3 remake. The game lends itself as realistic, but a zombie, which is just a former human, can take several rounds to the head from a high-powered rifle, when in reality, a lot of the head wouldn't even remain after several gunshots. But then, a thin metal security door can be used to crush their head in one go. Not a huge deal, but when it comes to atmosphere and in turn immersion, little aspects like that can take away from what it had going on.
You're safe. For now.
Thanks.
I think perhaps one of the most important aspects of building atmosphere within a game is sound design, both game music and sound effects. Sound effects are responsible for injecting life into a game, and as such should match the tone set by other aspects of the game. It isn't something that is often done wrong, but when it's done well, it's able to elevate immersion significantly. Red Dead Redemption 2 had amazing sound design within its world. Walking through the snow on a mountainside had everything that you could ask for. Snow crunching beneath your boots, your guns hanging from their slings being jostled on your back with the smallest twang of metal, wind blowing over the treetops nearby, creatures chattering away, warning each other of your presence. And don't even get me started when it happens to be a thunderstorm outside. These sound effects drive home the vastness of the outdoors in the game. It creates a sense of being minimalized and has the player feeling small in the world, either for the reason of inspiring adventure to explore all the world has to offer, or to portray the feeling that the world exists without the player, and their footprint has no lasting effect on the world. Both feelings could be appropriate for the tone and the theme of the game, and therefore are successful in building atmosphere. These sound effects could be considered ambiance, and most games have ambient sound, but there's a big difference in care that can be noticed when you look at games like Stardew Valley, which is mostly music ambiance, in comparison to Red Dead Redemption 2 that emphasizes the sound of its surrounding. But sound effects are more than just background noise. The noises that happen when you open your inventory or interact with any UI are just as important as sounds in the game. Fallout is perhaps one of the best at keeping the theme when doing things like scrolling through inventory by using the Pip-Boy. You interacting with these UI elements don't involve breaking the fourth wall, because your character is the one using the Pip-Boy that's on their wrist to scroll through these items. And in turn, the sound effects of the Pip-Boy, no matter what they were, would end up being appropriate because it's an object in the game. Music is the other half of sound design, and it deserves just as much attention as the sound effects. A properly composed soundtrack is something that can keep a game afloat at times. One of my favorite soundtracks of all time is that of Hollow Knight. Each composition was perfect in portraying the overall mood of a particular level as you entered it. The tunes over City of Tears is my favorite. Such a gloomy, rainy level in perpetual nightfall serenaded by the perfect composition to just leave you feeling stuck in a state of melancholy. Nothing communicates what kind of feeling or emotion a player should have better than music. And done well, it can transform an adequate game into an experience. Another way that games score music that is beneficial, rather than creating a whole composition for a game, is by licensing real music that is either popular at the time or appropriate for the time period of the game. Games that excel at this are titles like Fallout, Grand Theft Auto, and Mafia. The real music in these games plays through radios and around the world and in vehicles, and in Fallout's case, right off the Pip-Boy. These songs may not add to the atmosphere or be able to portray a particular mood in the right moment, but they do lend to immersion, which, as we all know, benefits the atmosphere in the end. When playing a game, other than visuals, the story is one of the first things that's thrown in your face. No matter what the story is, how it's told to the player is important in providing atmosphere and immersion. A lot of the time, games rely on cutscenes and or in-game dialogue to portray the story. There's nothing wrong with this. Most of the games I've listed above use this method, but there's some drawbacks to this way of storytelling. Cutscenes push the player into a listening mode rather than being part of the game, breaking the flow of gameplay. An in-game dialogue is often too pre-planned and reactive, and highly dependent on acting ability of the cast. Bastion is a game that avoids these methods by treating the game like a fantasy story being told to you. From the moment that the game starts, an omniscient narrator is describing what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen.
Finds his lifelong friend just lying in the road. Well, it's a touching reunion.
The story unfolds before you. You're playing out a fable, and the narrator is always there to give insight on it and provide plot depth. This form of narration allows the player to stay uninterrupted in a world while narration is taking place parallel to gameplay, never being pulled away. Maybe more importantly, it keeps the tone of the game as a fantasy fable. Every action you take is documented in this tale and aids in creating the legend that you are by the end of the game. Another great way storytelling can be achieved in conjunction with building atmosphere is environmental storytelling. Usually these things aren't exactly relevant to the main plot of the story, but still may offer some small details that strengthen the game's events, or may just be a side story unrelated to the plot entirely, but provide world building and cement the world around you as a living and breathing place. A Plague Tale: Innocence is a game that I've talked about before in regards to environmental storytelling. As you venture through the villages, you are exposed very rapidly to the state of the world and how devastated it is by the ongoing plague. The character you play as is a privileged child walled off from the troubles of the world, not involved with politics until the dam was broken and the troubles of the world were suddenly thrown in your face. You as the player piece this together as you explore these villages and homes of people. You see the horrors firsthand, the white paint markings on the houses of the infected, the abandoned market filled with rotten fruit, uncared for animals, just a whole population destroyed, sitting in stark contrast to your home, where it's business as usual. Other games like The Last of Us were also great in this regard. You are playing in this post-apocalypse world, and even though you're only concerned with the main characters of your story, the game makes sure that you're aware that there were others, through the notes that you find or the pictures you see hanging in homes left barren. You are just a small part of this world, and you are the main character of your story, but everyone else went through the same struggles, and maybe still are, but you're only left with the traces that they left behind. Other styles of this are text or audio logs left around a game world. In games such as Dead Space or Bioshock, narration, whether directly pertinent to the plot of the game or not, is not often something one associates with atmosphere, but it can help tremendously in keeping immersion consistent and creating a lively world to feel part of. I love to get lost in a world completely separate from my own, and that's done with atmosphere. Immersion helps as well, but atmosphere is what seals the deal. It's the X factor of games. It's something that I genuinely appreciate time and time again. I am by no means a game designer or pretend to have an understanding of design or game production. I'm simply a connoisseur of fine design and can talk about what speaks to me when it comes to these aspects, not necessarily what makes for the better game. I think atmosphere should be praised though. It's something that's deliberately injected into these games, and the artistic direction was meticulously designed and crafted to make these atmospheres. The developer took time to direct how they want the player to feel. They aim for the player's emotions towards a level, and I think that's amazing. A deliberate action to make so many elements of a game all be cohesive in theme and tone. And just so we're clear, a game doesn't need to excel in every aspect I mentioned in this video to have a great atmosphere. Really only one or two is needed to drive the point. Dead Space has amazing visual representation and sound design, but the plot leaves something to be desired. Stalker has great nearly everything, but the gameplay isn't the greatest technically, which draws from the immersion. The point being, not every aspect of a game needs to be perfect. There just needs to be an attempt from developers to create cohesion, and that leaves you with a game that makes a mark. A game with atmosphere. A game that you will remember. Thank you for watching. I do hope you enjoyed this. I hope to see you next time. Peace.